My name is Lucy. I'm in my early 30s now, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of person people describe as easygoing, low maintenance, or my personal favorite, the one who understands. I work a steady job, pay my bills on time, and show up when I say I will. From the outside, my life looks calm, ordinary, unremarkable in the best and worst ways. People often assume that because I don't raise my voice, because I pause before I speak, because I don't rush to defend myself, I must be unaffected, that I either don't notice things or that I notice them and simply don't care. What they don't see is that silence doesn't mean absence. It just means everything is happening inward, quietly, patiently. This story isn't about a single argument or a dramatic fallout. It's about years. Years of being asked to be understanding. Years of watching resources, attention, and emotional energy flow in one direction, while I was told that love doesn't need to be measured. Years of swallowing small disappointments because they didn't seem big enough to justify discomfort. And how eventually those small things added up to something that could no longer be ignored. I want to be clear about something from the beginning. This is not a revenge story. There's no shouting match, no explosive reveal, no moment where everyone suddenly realizes they were wrong and begs for forgiveness. There's also no villain monologue, no dramatic justice handed down by fate. What happened instead was quieter, slower, and in many ways more uncomfortable for them and for me. This is a story about favoritism that was never acknowledged, only normalized. About a family dynamic where one child's needs were seen as urgent and obvious, while another's were assumed to be optional. About how being the strong one can become a trap if no one ever asks whether you want to be strong all the time. It's also a story about timing, about what happens when you don't speak up at the first cut, or the second, or the 10th, not because you're afraid, but because you're still hoping things will balance out on their own. And about the moment you realize they won't. I'm sharing this now not to rewrite the past and not to paint myself as a hero. I made choices. Some of them were compassionate, some of them were avoidant, all of them were human. What I want to offer is honesty about what it feels like to be overlooked without being abused, dismissed without being hated, and how quiet people eventually change when they're pushed too far. If you've ever been the one who adjusted, who waited, who was told to understand while others were prioritized, have you ever wondered what would happen if you finally stopped adjusting? For most of my life, I wasn't the problem child. I also wasn't the golden one. I existed somewhere in between, useful, reliable, emotionally steady. The kind of presence that fills gaps without ever demanding space of its own. In my family, that role was praised in theory and ignored in practice. If you asked my parents to describe me, they would say, I was independent. That word came up a lot. Lucy's independent. Lucy doesn't need much. Lucy understands how hard things are. It was never said with cruelty. That's what made it harder to question. Independence, after all, sounds like a compliment. But over time, I learned it was also a justification for why I received less. I was the one who didn't ask for help with tuition, because I worked extra hours. The one who didn't complain when plans changed at the last minute. The one who offered to drive, to cover, to wait. When something needed to be done, I did it. When something needed to be sacrificed, I adjusted. And because I did it calmly, without protest, it became expected. My sibling, I'll call them Alex, was different. Louder in their needs, more openly emotional. When Alex struggled, it was visible. When Alex wanted something, it was framed as an urgency. Their stress registered as real. Mine was assumed to be manageable, not because I said it was, but because I didn't say it wasn't. Family gatherings made this dynamic clear in small, almost invisible ways. Conversations tilted toward Alex's challenges, Alex's goals, Alex's disappointments. When I spoke, people listened politely, then moved on. If I stayed quiet, no one noticed. Either way, the outcome was the same. I don't remember a moment when I consciously decided to become this version of myself. It happened gradually. Each time, I chose not to correct an assumption. Each time I told myself, it's not worth it. Each time I believed that being low maintenance made me easier to love. The truth is, I was proud of being dependable. I liked knowing people could count on me. I liked being calm when others weren't. But pride slowly blurred into habit, and habit hardened into identity. I wasn't just dependable, I was predictable. And predictable people are often overlooked, not out of malice, but because no one expects them to change. There were moments when I felt a flicker of discomfort, a comment about how Alex needed more support right now, a reminder that you're stronger than this. Those phrases were meant to reassure me. Instead, they quietly redefined my role. Strength became something I owed, not something I possessed. What's important to understand is that I didn't feel unloved. That's too simple. I felt assumed, assumed to be fine, assumed to cope, assumed to wait my turn, even when that turn never seemed to arrive. Love was there, but it was unevenly distributed, like light in a room where one corner stays dim because no one thinks to move the lamp. I told myself this was normal. Families aren't perfectly fair. Someone is always needier, louder, more complicated. I didn't want to be jealous. I didn't want to compete. I especially didn't want to be seen as ungrateful. So I became very good at minimizing my own reactions, explaining them away before anyone else had to. Looking back, I can see how carefully I maintained that image. Calm Lucy, sensible Lucy, Lucy, who doesn't make things difficult. It protected me in some ways. It also erased me in others. At the time, I didn't call it favoritism. That word felt too harsh, too accusatory. I told myself it was just a circumstance. Timing, personality differences, temporary imbalance. I believed that if I stayed patient long enough, things would naturally even out. What I didn't realize then was that patience, when it goes unchallenged, teaches people exactly how little they need to give you. The first time I remember feeling something sharp wasn't during a fight or a crisis. It was during an ordinary conversation. the kind you forget as soon as it ends, unless you're the one it quietly rearranges. I was in my mid-20s then, freshly settled into my first real job. Not glamorous, but stable. I just signed a lease on a small apartment, paid my own deposit, and bought secondhand furniture that smelled faintly of someone else's life. I was proud in a careful, private way. I didn't announce it. I just showed up to dinner one night and mentioned, casually, that I'd moved. My parents nodded, asked a few practical questions. Then, almost seamlessly, the conversation shifted to Alex. Alex was thinking about changing majors. Alex wasn't sure what direction felt right. Alex was stressed. The tone changed. Voices softened, attention sharpened, solutions were offered, reassurances flowed easily. I remember sitting there, fork paused mid-air, realizing no one had asked how I felt about living alone. Whether I was nervous, whether I needed anything, it wasn't that they were dismissive. They simply moved on, as if my update had been informational, not emotional. That was the cut. Small enough to ignore, clean enough to rationalize. I told myself it made sense. Alex was struggling. I wasn't. I'd said I was fine, after all. And in a literal sense, I was. I had a job, a roof, and no immediate crisis. Wanting acknowledgement felt indulgent by comparison. So I swallowed the feeling before it could even form into a complaint. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was confusion, a quiet recalibration. I remember thinking, oh, this is how it works. Not consciously, but somewhere deeper. I learned that milestones only mattered if they came wrapped in distress, that stability was invisible, that self-sufficiency, while praised, didn't invite care. After that, similar moments appeared more often. When Alex needed help with rent, family discussions became urgent and detailed. When I mentioned taking on extra freelance work to cover my own expenses, it was met with a quick, "That's good," and a change of subject. No one meant to compare us, but the comparison happened anyway. Each time, I made the same choice. I didn't correct it. I didn't say, actually, this matters to me. I told myself that speaking up would feel petty, that love shouldn't need to be negotiated, that if I asked for more, I'd be taking something away from someone who needed it more. The thing about small cuts is that they don't bleed much. They don't leave obvious scars. You don't stop what you're doing because of them. You keep moving, but your body remembers. Your mind keeps a quiet record, even when you pretend it doesn't. I started noticing how quickly my feelings were edited out of conversations. How often I preemptively minimized my own stress before anyone else could. "It's fine, really. I'll figure it out." Those phrases became reflexes, and the more I used them, the more people believed them. Looking back, I can see that this wasn't just something being done to me. I was participating. I was teaching them how to treat me, not intentionally, but consistently. And consistency is persuasive. At the time, though, all I knew was that something had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that I felt a faint distance between who I was living as and who I was being seen as. I didn't name it. I didn't confront it. I just adjusted. Again, I thought that was maturity. I didn't yet understand the cost. After that first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. And because nothing changed, I told myself nothing was wrong. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly. Like background noise you stop noticing because it's always been there. The patterns became familiar. If Alex needed support, the family mobilized. If I needed time, I took it silently. If Alex was overwhelmed, it was treated as an emergency. If I was exhausted, it was framed as something I could manage, not unkindly, just automatically. I learned to anticipate it. Before mentioning anything about my life, I'd quickly assess whether it sounded serious enough to deserve attention. Most of the time, I decided it didn't. So I edited myself, shared summaries instead of feelings, facts instead of context. I became very efficient at sounding okay. When people praised me, it was always for my composure. You handle things so well. You're so low drama. We never worry about you. Those statements were meant as compliments. I accepted them with a smile. Inside, they felt like a quiet closing door. There were moments when the imbalance was obvious enough that even I couldn't fully ignore it. Like the time Alex needed help replacing a car, and the family sat around the table discussing finances, timelines, and options. I listened, nodding, offering practical suggestions. No one asked how I'd managed when my own car broke down 2 years earlier. I hadn't asked for help then. I'd figured it out, so that chapter was considered closed. That became the unspoken rule. If you survive something alone, it no longer counts. I started to internalize the logic. If I wanted care, I had to be in crisis. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to fall apart just to be seen. I didn't want to perform vulnerability. So I chose the alternative, self-containment. To justify it, I built stories in my head. Alex needs more right now. My parents are doing their best. This is just a phase. I told myself I was being generous, understanding, and mature. And in a way, I was. But generosity without boundaries doesn't stay generous for long. It turns into self-erasure. What made it harder was that no one was explicitly dismissive. If I ever hinted at being tired or stressed, I was met with quick reassurance. You'll be fine. You always are. Those words landed each time. They stopped feeling supportive and started feeling predictive, like a verdict already reached. Slowly, I stopped expecting anything else. I didn't ask for help even when I needed it. Not because I thought it would be denied, but because I didn't want to disrupt the existing order. I didn't want to be compared. I didn't want to feel like I was competing with my own sibling for attention. So I withdrew emotionally while staying physically present. From the outside, I was the same Lucy, calm, responsible. There was no rebellion, no tension. Internally, though, I was learning a dangerous lesson that my needs were negotiable, optional, secondary. And once you accept that belief, it doesn't stay confined to family. It seeps outward into friendships, work, relationships. You become the person who overfunctions, who compensates, who doesn't make waves. People like you for it. They rely on you for it. and they rarely question whether it costs you anything. I remember telling myself that this was simply the price of being the stable one. Someone had to be better me than Alex, who seemed to feel everything so intensely. Better me, who could handle it. That was the lie that kept me quiet. I didn't see it as disrespect yet. I saw it as a responsibility, as a character, as a strength. And because I framed it that way, I kept accepting less, convincing myself I didn't need more, not realizing that every time I did, I was reinforcing a role that would eventually become impossible to live inside. There comes a point when patterns stop feeling accidental, when you can no longer explain them away as timing, circumstance, or personality differences. For me, that point arrived quietly without drama, during a moment that should have been insignificant. We were planning a family event, nothing major, just logistics. Dates, travel, who would handle what. As usual, tasks were distributed without much discussion. I was assigned the practical pieces: booking, coordinating, and making sure nothing was forgotten. Alex's role was left flexible, contingent on how they were feeling closer to the date. No one asked whether I had the time. No one checked if I wanted that responsibility. It was assumed, and I accepted it automatically, the way I always had. Then my mother said something offhand, almost fond. Well, Lucy will take care of it. She always does. The room moved on. But that sentence stayed with me. It wasn't what she said. It was the certainty with which she said it. Not hope, not gratitude, expectation. In that moment, I saw myself reflected back, not as a daughter with preferences and limits, but as a function, a stabilizer, the one who absorbs uncertainty so others don't have to. I wasn't angry, I felt clarified. I began to recognize the shape of the role I'd been playing for years. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the emotional buffer. When things went wrong, I smoothed them over. When tensions rose, I de escalated. When someone needed support, I offered it, often without being asked. And because I did it well, it became invisible. The irony is that I had helped build this role. Every time I stepped in early, every time I said, "It's fine," every time I handled things quietly to keep the peace, I reinforced the idea that I could, and would, do it again. There was no malice in it, just efficiency. But efficiency strips away choice. I started noticing how little curiosity there was about my inner life. People knew what I did, what I handled, what I managed. They didn't know what I wanted. Or maybe they assumed wanting was unnecessary for someone like me. Conversations with my parents felt increasingly transactional. Updates were exchanged, problems were solved, but there was no space where I was invited to be uncertain or needy or even undecided. Those states belonged to Alex. Mine belonged elsewhere or nowhere. The role extended beyond logistics. Emotionally, I was the one who listened without needing reassurance in return, who understood context, gave grace, explained things away. If someone was sharp with me, I softened it for them. If something felt unfair, I reframed it until it didn't sting as much. At some point, I realized that no one was asking me to do this anymore. They didn't have to. I was doing it by default. What unsettled me wasn't the imbalance itself, but how natural it felt, how little resistance I felt internally when I was overlooked. That's when I knew it wasn't just a family dynamic anymore. It was an identity. I wasn't seen as someone who might reach a limit. I was seen as someone without one. And the most uncomfortable truth was this: as long as I continued to fulfill that role, there was no incentive for anyone to question it. The system worked, just not for me. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary. I simply started paying attention to how often my needs were assumed away, to how quickly I volunteered, how rarely anyone checked whether I wanted to be the strong one. That awareness didn't change anything immediately, but it marked the end of something, the end of my belief that this role was temporary, the end of my hope that things would naturally rebalance. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a difficult possibility: that if I wanted things to change, I would have to change first. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no tears, no confrontation that could be pointed to later as the moment everything broke. In fact, if you asked anyone else who was there, they probably wouldn't remember it at all. I remember it because of how quiet it was. I had come home after a long day, one of those days that drains you in small, cumulative ways. Nothing terrible had happened, just meetings, decisions, emotional labor that wasn't mine, but somehow always landed with me. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't really want, scrolling through messages. There was one from my mother, short, practical. She was asking if I could help Alex with something again. Not an emergency, just support, guidance, time. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. My first instinct was automatic. Of course. I even started typing it. The words appeared easily, muscle memory guiding my fingers. Then I stopped, not because I was angry, not because I wanted to refuse, but because I felt something new, a heaviness that wasn't exhaustion. It was clarity. I realized that no one had asked how my day had been. No one had checked whether I had the capacity. The request wasn't unreasonable on its own. What made it heavy was its familiarity, the assumption that my time, my energy, and my attention were always available, that I would stretch without being asked whether I could. I deleted the message I'd started typing. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing, not planning, not rehearsing an explanation, just noticing how uncomfortable it felt to pause. That discomfort told me more than any argument could have. I eventually replied. I said I couldn't help right now. No long explanation, no apology wrapped in justification, just a simple boundary. The response was polite, understanding even, but something in the tone shifted. A pause, a recalibration. It was subtle, but I felt it. That night, lying in bed, I didn't feel guilty the way I expected to. I felt unsettled, as if I'd stepped slightly out of alignment with a version of myself I'd been maintaining for years. The world hadn't ended. No one was angry. And yet something inside me had moved. I started replaying past moments, not to accuse, but to observe. How often I'd said yes when I meant maybe. How often I'd filled in gaps before anyone noticed they existed. How often my silence had been mistaken for consent. What shifted that day wasn't my behavior so much as my perspective. I stopped seeing my role as inevitable. I started seeing it as chosen. And if it was chosen, it could be unchosen. That realization was both empowering and frightening. Empowering because it meant I wasn't trapped. Frightening because it meant I had been participating all along. I didn't decide to confront anyone. I didn't plan a speech. I simply decided to pay attention to myself, to my capacity, my resentment, my quiet disappointments, to stop smoothing things over automatically. Nothing changed immediately. On the outside, life continued as usual, but internally, there was a new line I couldn't unsee. A before and after. Before, I believed that being needed was the same as being valued. After, I wasn't so sure. That was the day something shifted. Not outwardly, inwardly. And once it did, I knew I wouldn't be able to return to the version of myself who said yes without checking in. After that day, I didn't announce a change. I didn't explain myself or renegotiate my role out loud. On the surface, I remained exactly who I had always been: calm, composed, agreeable. The difference was internal. For the first time, my silence wasn't automatic. It was intentional. I began to pause before responding, before volunteering, before stepping in to solve problems that weren't mine. Those pauses were invisible to everyone else, but they changed everything for me. In that space, I asked a simple question. Do I actually want to do this? Not can I? I'd proven that countless times. But do I want to? Often the answer surprised me. When requests came in, helping Alex think through another decision, mediating a minor family tension, taking on logistical tasks, I didn't rush. Sometimes I still said yes, but now it was a choice, not a reflex. Other times, I declined, briefly, calmly, without the elaborate emotional cushioning I used to provide. No one accused me of changing, not directly. Instead, there was confusion, small hesitations in conversations, a sense that the system was misfiring. I could feel it in the way my parents started explaining things to me more carefully, as if anticipating resistance that never used to exist. In the way Alex checked in less often, then more pointedly. My silence, once invisible, now felt noticeable simply because it wasn't filled. What fascinated me was how quickly my restraint was misinterpreted. Because I wasn't offering constant reassurance, people assumed I was fine. Because I wasn't protesting, they assumed I had no issue. Because I didn't explain myself, they filled in the gaps with old assumptions. Lucy is still Lucy. Lucy understands. They mistook my quiet for compliance. That worked in my favor. I listened more than I spoke. I observed how decisions were made, who was consulted, and whose comfort was prioritized. I noticed how often my absence created small inconveniences, how tasks I used to absorb floated awkwardly waiting for someone else to notice them. And still, I said nothing, not out of spite, out of discipline. There was power in not correcting people, in allowing them to operate on outdated expectations, while I recalibrated privately. I wasn't withdrawing emotionally, I was redirecting my energy toward my work, my finances. My sense of self had been deferred for too long. I started documenting things, not in a dramatic way, but practically. Dates, conversations, patterns, not because I planned to confront anyone, but because I wanted clarity. I wanted to know for myself that what I was experiencing wasn't imagined. The more I paid attention, the clearer it became. My role had been convenient, and convenience, once disrupted, reveals how much was being taken for granted. Still, I didn't rush. Quiet dominance isn't about force. It's about timing, about letting others underestimate the shift while you solidify it internally. I could feel a new stability forming, not the kind that comes from being needed, but the kind that comes from knowing your limits and honoring them. It was unfamiliar, a little lonely, but it was mine. And while no one said it out loud, I sensed the beginning of unease, the subtle realization that something had changed, even if they couldn't quite name what. They thought my silence meant I was still playing the same role. They didn't realize I'd stepped out of it already. While everything on the surface appeared unchanged, my inner world was reorganizing itself with quiet precision. That was the part no one noticed, because from the outside I still looked the same, calm, cooperative, present just enough to avoid suspicion. But internally, I had shifted from endurance to intention. I began to take inventory of my life in a way I never had before. Not emotionally at first, practically. I looked at my finances with clear eyes, how much I earned, how much I saved, where my money went, how often I stepped in financially or logistically without being asked. I realized that my independence hadn't just been emotional, it had been material. I had built stability quietly, without assistance, while others assumed I had less because I asked for nothing. I stopped offering that surplus automatically. I also started paying attention to information. Family dynamics thrive on shared assumptions and unspoken agreements. I'd been part of that system long enough to know where things were vague, where responsibilities blurred, where expectations existed without being articulated. I began documenting those gaps, not to weaponize them, but to understand them. No one noticed, because they didn't expect me to prepare. They expected me to cope. I listened carefully during conversations, not just to what was said, but to what was implied. Who deferred to whom? Which concerns were taken seriously? Which were smoothed over? I noticed how often Alex's uncertainty was framed as potential, while mine was framed as stability. One was nurtured, the other was relied upon. At the same time, I was building something separate. I invested in skills that had nothing to do with my family role. Financial planning, long-term contracts, legal literacy, not because I anticipated conflict, but because I wanted autonomy. True autonomy, not the performative kind that comes from never asking for help, but the kind that gives you options. The irony is that my family had always seen me as the least risky, the safest bet. They didn't realize that safety came from foresight, from patience, from knowing how to move quietly without needing validation. I didn't talk about these changes. I didn't hint at them. I let people believe what they wanted, that I was still the same Lucy, still available, still flexible. Their assumptions gave me space. There's a strange freedom in being underestimated. When people don't expect resistance, they don't watch closely. They don't ask questions. They don't notice when you start stepping out of alignment. I was no longer reacting. I was positioning. This wasn't about getting even. It was about ensuring that whatever came next, I wouldn't be cornered by obligation or guilt. That if a line was crossed, I would have the clarity and the means to respond without chaos. What they never noticed was that my silence wasn't emptiness. It was an accumulation, knowledge, stability, leverage that came not from confrontation, but from preparation. And because there was no visible conflict, no one thought to ask what I was preparing for. I wasn't sure yet either, but I knew this. I was done being surprised. The reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I wasn't emotional. I was almost calm to the point of detachment, which surprised me. I'd expected anger or grief, or at least a sense of betrayal sharp enough to hurt. Instead, what I felt was recognition, like finally naming a shape I'd been tracing in the dark for years. It happened while I was reviewing documents, ordinary ones, family plans, long-term arrangements that had been discussed loosely over the years but never examined closely. I wasn't snooping. I had access because I was considered trustworthy, responsible, the one who handled details. As I read, a pattern emerged that mirrored everything I'd felt emotionally, but now, in concrete terms. Commitments that favored Alex, contingencies built around their needs, assumptions embedded so deeply they weren't even questioned. My role, again, was implied rather than stated. Supportive, flexible, secondary. There it was, in writing. Not malicious, not dramatic, just structured that way. I sat with that realization for a long time, not to spiral, but to absorb it fully. Because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. And I needed to be sure I wasn't projecting. I reread everything, cross-checked, considered alternative interpretations. There weren't many. What struck me most was not the imbalance itself, but how normal it was to everyone else. This wasn't a secret plan to exclude me. It was the natural outcome of years of assumptions about who needed more, who could handle less, who would always adjust. In that moment, I understood something crucial. If nothing changed, this would continue indefinitely. Not because anyone intended harm, but because the system was working exactly as designed. I didn't feel the urge to confront anyone with the documents. That would have turned the focus outward into explanations and defensiveness. Instead, I turned inward. I asked myself what I wanted, not emotionally, but practically. I wanted a choice. That meant understanding my position fully, where I stood, what I was entitled to, what I had already contributed without acknowledgement, what I could step back from without causing immediate collapse, and what would happen if I did. The reveal wasn't a weapon, it was a map. I closed the documents and didn't mention them to anyone. Not yet. There was no rush. Timing mattered more than exposure. And I had learned that clarity, once gained, doesn't demand immediate action. It demands restraint. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks because for the first time, I wasn't wondering whether I was imagining things. I wasn't. There's a moment after clarity arrives when nothing happens externally, but everything becomes final internally. That was where I found myself. I didn't make a decision right away. I lived inside the awareness for a while, let it breathe, let it settle into my bones. Because decisions made too quickly still belong partly to emotion, and I wanted mine to belong entirely to truth. Once you see the structure clearly, you realize something unsettling. There are always more options than you thought, and none of them are painless. I listed them quietly, one by one. I could confront my parents, lay everything out, explain how the imbalance has affected me over the years. Ask, politely, rationally, for things to change. That option appealed to the part of me that still hoped to be understood. But I also knew what would happen. There would be shock, then defensiveness, explanations, intentions would be emphasized, love would be asserted, and the underlying structure would remain mostly intact, just softened enough to quiet the discomfort. I could confront Alex, name the dynamic directly, ask for acknowledgement, but that would have shifted the burden again onto me, to manage emotions, to keep things calm, to be reasonable. And it would place Alex in a position they had never asked to examine. Resentment would grow where responsibility had never been assigned. I could do nothing, continue as I had, just with more awareness, protect myself quietly, disengage emotionally, and accept that this was simply how things were. That option felt safe, familiar, but it also felt like a slow erosion, like agreeing to live in a room where the ceiling was always just a little too low. Then there was the option I hadn't allowed myself to consider before, the irreversible one. The option where I didn't ask for permission to be treated differently. The option where I changed my participation instead of asking others to change their behavior. That option came with consequences. Real ones. Distance. Misunderstanding. A loss of the version of myself that everyone felt comfortable with. It meant letting go of being seen as the good one, the easy one, the one who made things work. It meant being okay with discomfort, mine and theirs. I sat with that choice longer than the others because it didn't involve a conversation. It involved action, quiet action, structural action, the kind that doesn't announce itself but reshapes the future regardless. What made the decision unavoidable was this realization. As long as I remained available in the same ways, nothing would truly change. Not because they were cruel, but because they had no reason to rethink a system that worked for them. Clarity removes innocence. Once I understood that, I also understood that going back, pretending I hadn't seen it, was no longer an option. That would be a betrayal of myself, and worse, a deliberate one. I thought about who I had been, the years I'd spent being flexible, the pride I'd taken in not needing much, the quiet sacrifices that never made it into the family narrative because they didn't come with urgency or drama. I didn't feel angry about those years. I felt complete with them, like they had taught me everything they were going to teach me. The question wasn't, what do they deserve? The question was, What do I refuse to keep paying for? That was the moment the decision became clear. I chose the path that didn't require validation. I chose to stop positioning my life around their expectations. I chose to disentangle myself from roles that existed only because I'd never stepped away from them. This didn't mean cutting people off. It didn't mean punishment. It meant restructuring my involvement so thoroughly that the old assumptions would eventually collapse under their own weight. And here's the thing, no one tells you about irreversible decisions. They're often quiet. They don't come with adrenaline. They come with calm. Once I chose, I felt steady, not triumphant, not relieved, just aligned. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. Not all at once, not dramatically, but step by step. There would be no announcement, no declaration, no emotional reckoning. The change would be experienced, not explained. That's the difference between reaction and authorship. Reaction seeks recognition. Authorship doesn't require witnesses. By the end of that week, I had made internal commitments I wouldn't be undoing. I adjusted plans, rewrote priorities, redirected resources, time, money, energy away from places where they had been assumed and toward places where they were chosen. Nothing outward looked different yet, but the future had already shifted. Because once you decide to stop being the person who absorbs imbalance, the entire structure begins to strain, even before anyone realizes why. And I knew, with complete certainty, that there was no version of myself left who would step back into the old role just to keep things comfortable. That chapter was closed, quietly, completely, irreversibly. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. That surprised me. I'd always assumed that change required momentum, that you had to act quickly before fear talked you out of it. But this wasn't fear-driven. It was clarity-driven. And clarity is patient. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy for its own sake. It's about precision, about understanding that the loudest moves are often the least effective, and that real shifts happen when systems are altered quietly before anyone realizes they depended on you to keep them running. I started with the most basic resource, time. I audited where my time actually went, not where I thought it went, but where it was being pulled. Family, calls that stretched longer than they needed to. Quick questions that turned into emotional processing sessions. Tasks I handled simply because I always had. I didn't cut them all off at once. That would have drawn attention. Instead, I shortened them. Delayed responses. Let silence sit where I used to fill it. No explanations. Just availability adjusted to reality. Then I moved to finances. Not because money was the core issue, but because money reveals truth quickly. I separated accounts more cleanly, clarified what was mine and what had been informally shared. I stopped fronting costs that were never explicitly discussed, but always assumed. If something required a contribution, I asked for details. If details weren't available, I declined, not angrily, neutrally. It was astonishing how often clarity alone ended the conversation. I also reviewed long-term arrangements, the ones people talk about vaguely, as if they'll sort themselves out later. I made sure my name wasn't attached to responsibilities I hadn't agreed to. Where it was, I adjusted it, legally, properly, calmly, no drama, just alignment. This part wasn't visible. That was the point. I wasn't withdrawing from my family emotionally. I was withdrawing from automatic obligation. There's a difference. I still showed up to gatherings, still listened, still cared. I simply stopped being the invisible infrastructure that made everything easier without being acknowledged. At work, I made similar changes. I stopped compensating for others' disorganization. I documented my contributions, set clearer boundaries around the scope, asked questions instead of absorbing assumptions. The effect was subtle but immediate. People became more precise around me, more respectful of my time, because I required it. That was when I fully understood something I'd only sensed before. People don't push against boundaries that exist. They push against absence. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means the work is internal, structural, and already underway. There were moments of temptation to explain myself, to justify the shift, to reassure everyone that I wasn't changing, but I caught myself. Reassurance would have pulled me back into the old role. It would have made their comfort my responsibility again. So I let the discomfort exist. What I noticed slowly was how much of the system relied on my anticipation. When I stopped anticipating, things didn't collapse, but they did wobble. Decisions took longer, details were missed, small frustrations surfaced. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to be felt. And still, no one connected it to me. That's the thing about moving in silence. When you've been invisible for long enough, your absence is experienced as an inconvenience, not a cause. People sense a loss without knowing where it originated. I also invested in my own future in ways that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. I committed to plans I hadn't shared, goals I hadn't announced. I built buffers, financial, emotional, logistical, that ensured I wouldn't be cornered into helping out of necessity later. This wasn't isolation, it was insulation. I became careful about information, not secretive, selective. I stopped volunteering details about my capacity, my plans, my resources, not because I owed no one anything, but because transparency without boundaries had never served me. People filled the gaps with old assumptions. That worked for me. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching how little attention was paid to the person who had once held everything together. Not because I wanted to be missed, but because it confirmed something important. My value had been functional, not relational. And once the function was removed, the relationship had to recalibrate or reveal its limits. I wasn't waiting for gratitude. I wasn't even waiting for recognition. I was waiting for the structure to respond to reality instead of habit. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing exploded. Nothing was revealed, but the groundwork was done. The paths had shifted. The safety nets I used to provide were no longer assumed. The future no longer rested on my quiet compliance. I had moved enough pieces that reversing course would require effort from everyone, including me. And that's how I knew it was real. Because the most powerful changes are the ones you can't undo without admitting something has changed. I wasn't forcing anyone to confront the imbalance. I was simply no longer compensating for it. And the system, slowly, inevitably, began to feel the difference. Consequences rarely arrive the way people expect. They don't crash all at once. They seep in. They show up as confusion first, then inconvenience, then a slow growing discomfort that no one can quite explain. That's how it started. At first, it was small things, plans that took longer to finalize, questions that circled without landing, tasks that used to be handled now float awkwardly in conversation, waiting for someone to claim them. I noticed, but I didn't step in. I let the silence do its work. My parents began calling more often, not to ask for help directly, but to talk things through. Long explanations, repeated details. They were trying to recreate a rhythm that no longer existed, sensing its absence without understanding the cause. I listened, responded kindly, and didn't offer solutions unless explicitly asked. Even then, I kept them minimal. Alex felt it differently. For them, the change registered as friction. Things that used to resolve themselves now require effort. Support that once arrived preemptively now had to be requested. And requests, when made, didn't always land the way they used to. There was no accusation, just surprise. I could hear it in the pauses. The slight hesitation before a question. The recalculation occurred when I didn't immediately agree. Alex wasn't used to resistance, not overt resistance, but the kind that comes from someone no longer rearranging themselves automatically. The family system didn't panic right away. Systems rarely do. They try to self-correct first. My parents started offering suggestions instead of making decisions. They checked in more often, asking whether certain plans worked for everyone. That word, everyone, had rarely included me before. Now it appeared tentatively, as if newly introduced. But old habits die slowly. When something fell through, eyes still turned toward me. When tension arose, my calm was still expected to absorb it. The difference was that I no longer rushed to fulfill that expectation. I didn't refuse. I simply didn't anticipate. And that's when the discomfort sharpened. People don't notice support when it's constant. They notice its absence immediately, not as loss at first, but as irritation, as inefficiency, as something being off. I became aware of subtle resentment, not directed at me personally, but at the situation. Why was this harder now? Why was everyone so busy? Why did things feel less smooth? No one asked the obvious question: who was making it smooth before? Because asking that would require acknowledging something uncomfortable, that ease had come from somewhere, and that someone had been carrying it quietly for a long time. The most telling moment came during a family discussion that stalled completely. Not a crisis, just a decision that needed coordination. Everyone talked around it. No one finalized anything. The conversation looped, then dissolved. Later, my mother called me. She didn't say, "Why didn't you step in?" She said, "Things feel more complicated lately." I let that sentence hang. "Yes," I replied calmly, "they do." That was it. No explanation, no reassurance, no attempt to fix it. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, it was unsettled. From that point on, the consequences accelerated, not dramatically, but noticeably. People started having to negotiate roles explicitly. Ask instead of assuming. Consider timing. Consider capacity. The emotional labor I used to perform invisibly now had to be distributed. And distribution is rarely fair when it's new. Alex struggled more openly, not because I'd done anything to them, but because the safety net they were used to had thinned. They weren't weaker than me. They were simply less practiced at self-support. That difference had been masked by my constant presence. I watched this without satisfaction. There was no pleasure in seeing them uncomfortable, only confirmation. Confirmation that what I had provided hadn't been extra. It had been essential. And essential things, when removed, are felt. My parents oscillated between concern and confusion. They sensed that something had shifted but couldn't locate it because nothing had been said. No boundary had been announced. No conflict had been staged. That made it harder to argue with. What do you push against when no one is pushing you? What do you accuse when no one has accused you? The family dynamic began to strain under the weight of unspoken recalibration. Not because I was punishing anyone, but because I was no longer compensating. That distinction mattered deeply to me. I wasn't withdrawing love. I was withdrawing unpaid labor, emotional, logistical, financial, the kind that had been so normalized no one thought to name it. And once named, once felt, it couldn't be ignored. There were moments when I could have stepped in and restored the old balance, smoothed things over, fixed the inefficiencies, made everyone comfortable again. I chose not to, not out of cruelty, out of respect for myself and for the truth that had finally surfaced. Because once consequences begin, intervening too early only delays the lesson. And I had learned, over years of being the understanding one, that delaying the lesson only ensures it comes back louder. This time I stayed quiet, and the system continued to adjust, unevenly, uncomfortably, but honestly. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet shifts. They assume there will be a moment, a conversation, an apology, a reset, where things can be put back the way they were. But reversibility depends on timing, and timing depends on awareness. My family's awareness came late. It arrived not as insight, but as panic. Small inconveniences had turned into repeated strain. Decisions dragged on. Support systems felt unreliable. The emotional ease they were used to, especially my parents, had eroded. They started to feel tired in a way they couldn't explain, overextended, confused about why things that once felt manageable now feel heavy. That's when the questions started changing. Can you help with this? But are you upset with us? That question marked a turning point because it revealed something important. They were no longer trying to solve logistics. They were trying to restore comfort. And comfort, once disrupted long enough, becomes something people chase desperately. My parents began reaching out more deliberately, checking in, offering to help me with things I'd already handled on my own years ago, bringing up memories, shared stories, gestures meant to reconnect me to a role I'd quietly left behind. It wasn't manipulative, it was reactive. They were responding to absence, not understanding its cause. Alex, meanwhile, oscillated between frustration and confusion, at times defensive, at times needy. They sensed the shift most acutely because they'd benefited from the old dynamic most directly. The loss felt personal, even though it wasn't targeted. There were moments when I could see regret forming, half-formed, unsure of where to land. Comments like, "I didn't realize you'd been carrying so much," or I guess we just assumed you were fine. Those statements came closer to acknowledgement than anything before, but they came after the structure had already changed. Because here's the truth that's hardest to accept. Insight doesn't undo pattern. Awareness doesn't erase years of reinforcement. And apologies, sincere or not, don't automatically restore trust once someone has rebuilt themselves without you. They wanted to talk it through. I listened. They wanted to revisit old decisions, reframe intentions, and emphasize love. I believed them. I never doubted that they cared in the way they knew how. But caring after the fact doesn't replace care given at the right time. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement anymore. I had already adjusted my life around its absence. My capacity had been reallocated. My future plans had been set. My sense of self was no longer tied to whether they saw me correctly. So when my mother asked, carefully, "What can we do to make this right?" I answered honestly. "You can't make it right," I said, "but we can move forward differently." That answer unsettled her more than anger would have, because different meant accepting that the old version of me, the endlessly flexible one, was gone, not withheld, not negotiating, gone. They were too late, not because they didn't care. They were too late because I had already learned how to live without waiting. And once someone has done that, you can't unteach it with good intentions. The panic passed, eventually, replaced by a quieter grief, a recognition that something familiar had ended without a clear moment to mourn it. No argument to point to. No fight to resolve, just a before and after. They tried, in small ways, to adapt, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes sincerely. But the center of gravity had shifted. I no longer orbited the family system the way I once had. And that couldn't be reversed without me volunteering to step back into a shape that no longer fits. I didn't hate them for realizing too late. I simply refused to pretend it was early enough to start over. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no dramatic unveiling of grievances, no list of wrongs pulled from memory like evidence in a trial. By the time we sat down together, my parents, Alex and me, I had already said everything that needed saying through my actions. The conversation happened because they asked for it, carefully, almost formally. They wanted clarity. They wanted to understand what had changed and whether it could be changed back. I agreed to talk because I was no longer afraid of the outcome. We sat at the same table where so many other discussions had taken place over the years. The setting was familiar. That was intentional. I didn't want the environment to escalate at that moment. This wasn't about creating impact. It was about accuracy. My mother spoke first. She said they felt distance, that they were worried they had done something wrong. Those things no longer felt connected the way they used to. I listened without interrupting, not because I was suppressing emotion, but because I didn't need to defend myself. When she finished, there was a pause, one that would have once made me rush in to reassure her. I didn't. When I spoke, my voice was steady, almost neutral. I didn't accuse. I described. I talked about patterns, not incidents, about assumptions, not intentions, about how being seen as the strong one had slowly turned into being unseen altogether. I explained that I had learned to take care of myself, not because I didn't need support, but because support rarely arrived unless I was in crisis. Alex shifted in their seat, not angrily, uncomfortably. Recognition was beginning to settle in. I made it clear that I didn't think anyone had tried to hurt me, that this wasn't about blame. But I also made it clear that understanding something in hindsight didn't undo its impact. The most important thing I said was this: I stopped stepping in because I realized I was the only one noticing the imbalance. And carrying it alone was costing me more than I was willing to keep paying. No one argued with that. There were apologies, quiet ones, uneven ones. My parents expressed regret. Alex admitted they'd never thought about it that way. I believed all of it, but belief didn't equal reversal. When they asked what I needed going forward, I didn't ask for promises. I didn't ask to be prioritized or compensated. I asked for something simpler, a simpler and harder. I need you to stop assuming, I said. If you want something from me, ask. If you're making plans that involve me, include me early. And if I say no, don't read into it. There was a long silence after that, not resistance, processing. I could feel the difference between this conversation and every imagined one I'd rehearsed over the years. This one wasn't fueled by resentment. It wasn't trying to fix the past. It was setting terms for the future. That's why there was no heat. Heat comes from wanting someone to feel what you felt. I didn't need that anymore. When the conversation ended, nothing felt resolved in a neat way. But something important had happened. The truth had been spoken without distortion, without emotional excess, without performance, and that made it harder to dismiss. As we stood to leave, my mother touched my arm and said softly, "We didn't know." I met her eyes and replied just as softly, "I know." That was the most honest exchange we'd ever had. Who I am now is not louder than who I was before. That's the part people often expect, that after everything, I would emerge sharper, harder, more visibly assertive. But that isn't what happened. I didn't replace silence with noise. I replaced automatic silence with chosen presence. The biggest change isn't in how I speak, it's in how I decide. I no longer measure my worth by how useful I am to other people's comfort. I don't scan rooms looking for what needs to be fixed. I don't preemptively absorb tension. When something isn't mine, I let it remain where it belongs. That doesn't make me colder. It makes it clearer. My relationships are fewer, but more accurate. The people in my life now know that access to me isn't guaranteed by history or proximity. It's sustained by mutual respect. That has filtered out a lot of noise. What remains is quieter, steadier, and real. With my family, things are different. Not broken, but redefined. There is more intention now, more asking, more pauses before assumptions. It isn't perfect. Sometimes old habits surface. When they do, I don't correct them emotionally. I correct them structurally, by responding differently, by choosing myself without explanation. Alex and I exist on more equal footing now, not because they were pushed down, but because I stopped holding the imbalance up. We're still siblings, still connected, but I'm no longer positioned as the emotional buffer between them and the world. That responsibility was never mine to carry alone. My parents are learning, slowly, that strength doesn't mean surplus, that independence doesn't mean immunity. Watching them adjust has been bittersweet. I can see the regret. I can also see the growth. Both are real. Internally, I feel anchored in a way I never did before. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing I won't abandon myself to maintain peace, that I can tolerate misunderstanding without rushing to correct it, that I can be loved imperfectly and still choose myself. The old version of me believed that harmony required self-erasure. This version understands that harmony without self-respect is just silence dressed up as virtue. I still care deeply. I still show up. I still listen. The difference is that I don't disappear inside those acts anymore. My presence has weight now because it isn't automatic. And perhaps the most unexpected change is this. I don't feel the need to prove anything. Not that I was wronged, not that I was right to step back, not that anyone failed me. I know what I lived. I know what it costs. And I know what it took to stop paying that price. That knowledge doesn't make me dominant in a loud way. It makes me immovable in a quiet one. For a long time, I thought this story needed a verdict. Someone right, someone wrong. A clear lesson was delivered neatly at the end. So, everything could be categorized and filed away. But life doesn't work like that, especially not the quiet parts. Especially not the kinds of harm that happen without cruelty, and the kinds of strength that form without applause. What I learned is simpler and harder than I expected. People don't always withhold out of malice. Often they withhold because the system around them doesn't force awareness, because someone keeps absorbing the imbalance so efficiently that no one feels its weight. Love can exist alongside neglect when neglect is quiet enough. And the person who carries the most rarely looks like they're carrying anything at all. For years, I believed that being understanding was the same as being kind, that if I just adjusted enough, things would even out naturally. But understanding without limits doesn't stay kind. It becomes permission for others to keep taking without realizing they are taking. The moral of this story isn't speak up sooner, because timing is personal, and silence is sometimes survival. The moral is this: if you are always the one who adapts, the system will adapt around your absence before it ever adapts around your pain. Change didn't come when I explained myself better. It came when I stopped compensating, when I let the imbalance be felt instead of quietly neutralizing it, when I chose clarity over comfort, my own and everyone else's. There was no revenge in that choice, no punishment, just honesty, enacted instead of argued. And here's the part I want to leave you with. If you recognize yourself in this story, not as the villain, not even necessarily as the overlooked one, but as someone who has been praised for being strong, easy, understanding, I want you to ask yourself one question. Are you being appreciated, or are you being relied on? Because those two things feel similar at first, but they lead to very different futures. If this resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been the one who carried more because you could? And what happened when you finally stopped? Thank you for listening.